Right now, somewhere online, someone is posting a photo of two Gothic towers and a blue suspension bridge, and captioning it London Bridge. They're wrong. That's Tower Bridge. It's half a mile downriver, and it has spent over a century quietly stealing the identity of a much older, much stranger structure. The real London Bridge is flat. It's grey. It's concrete. Most tourists walk across it without even looking down. And that plain, forgettable bridge is arguably the single most important structure in the history of London. It has been pulled down by Vikings, maybe. It once carried 200 buildings and hundreds of residents who never touched solid ground. For over 300 years, it displayed the tarred, severed heads of traitors on spikes, including a former Lord Chancellor of England. It survived the fire that nearly burned the entire city to ash. And in 1968, it was sold, piece by numbered piece, to an American chainsaw manufacturer, who shipped it across the Atlantic and rebuilt it in the middle of the Arizona desert. Almost none of that is what most people think they know about London Bridge. So let's take it apart, piece by piece, the same way it's been taken apart, for real, at least 4 times in the last 2,000 years. London exists because of this bridge. Not was shaped by it. Exists. Around AD 50, a few years after the Roman conquest of Britain, Roman engineers found the narrowest reliable crossing point on the River Thames. They drove wooden piles into the riverbed and built a timber bridge connecting the north and south banks. A trading settlement grew up around the northern end of it. The Romans called that settlement Londinium. No bridge, no obvious reason to build a city on this particular bend of a muddy tidal river. That's not an exaggeration, that's the geography. The city's first years were brutal. Around AD 60, Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, led a revolt against Roman rule, and Londinium, bridge included, was burned to the ground. The Romans crushed the rebellion and rebuilt on the same spot. And here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. For almost 2,000 years since, nearly every version of London Bridge that has ever existed has stood in roughly that same place. That location was never an accident, either. 2 major Roman roads, Watling Street from the northwest, Stane Street from the southwest, converged right at this river crossing, turning Londinium into a natural hub for trade and troops across the entire Roman province. Archaeologists have actually pulled the remains of Roman timber piles out of the riverbed near the modern bridge. That's not folklore. That's physical, datable proof that a working crossing stood here nearly 2,000 years ago, more or less exactly where London Bridge stands today. Then Rome left. In the early 5th century, Roman administration collapsed across Britain, and London was largely abandoned for roughly 2.5 centuries. Whatever remained of the bridge decayed along with it. It was Alfred the Great who refounded London as a fortified town in 886, and across the following centuries, new timber bridges rose and fell, burned, flooded, and at least once, allegedly, destroyed in war. Here's where the most famous story in this entire video shows up, and it's far less certain than most people assume. According to the Heimskringla, an Old Norse saga written around 2 centuries after the events it claims to describe, the Viking leader Olaf Haraldsson, later canonized as Norway's patron saint, pulled the timber bridge down in the year 1014, using ropes tied to his ships. He was supposedly working for the English king Ethelred the Unready, trying to cut off Danish forces occupying Southwark on the opposite bank. It's a great story. It might not be true. No source written closer to the actual event backs it up, and the original saga verse is far less dramatic than later English translations made it sound. Historians are genuinely split. But true or not, this half-legendary attack is the leading theory behind one of the most famous nursery rhymes in the English language, London Bridge is falling down. And that rhyme is stranger than almost anyone realizes. It was first printed in England in 1744, in a collection called Tommy Thumb's Pretty Song Book, but most scholars think it existed in some form for centuries before that. Nobody has ever definitively settled what it actually means. The Viking attack theory is the most popular. But the Victorian folklorist Alice Bertha Gomm proposed something considerably darker, that the rhyme preserves a medieval superstition, that a bridge needed a human sacrifice buried in its foundations to stay standing. To be completely clear, there is no archaeological evidence that anyone was ever buried under the real London Bridge. Most historians treat this as folklore, not fact. It's a chilling theory. It is not a documented one. Then there's the mystery of the fair lady in the song. Candidates range from Matilda of Scotland, Queen to Henry I, who genuinely did fund several bridges in the 12th century, to Eleanor of Provence, a queen so unpopular that a London mob once pelted her royal barge with rubbish as it passed under the bridge? Nobody knows. What we do know is that generations of British and American children have spent centuries singing about a bridge collapsing, a bridge that, in its most famous stone form, actually stood for 600 years and barely fell down at all. And this rhyme's influence goes far beyond the playground. T.S. Eliot quoted its central line directly in The Waste Land in 1922, using a collapsing bridge as a symbol of a civilization crumbling after the First World War. Some scholars think the song's mysterious Fair Lady may have partly inspired the title of the 1956 musical My Fair Lady, though that link is speculative, not confirmed. And it isn't even a uniquely English idea. Germany has Die Magdeburger Brücke. Denmark has Nippelsbro gar op og ned. France has Pontoise. Either this anxious little idea about a bridge that keeps failing traveled across an entire continent, or a continent that depended on bridges for survival just kept inventing the same nightmare independently. None of those timber crossings are what earned London Bridge its legend. That honor belongs to the stone bridge, and it starts with one underappreciated man. In 1176, King Henry II commissioned a permanent stone bridge across the Thames, a genuinely radical idea, because this river rose and fell by 15 to 20 feet twice a day with the tide. Nobody in England had built anything like it. The project was overseen by a priest named Peter of Colechurch, chaplain of St. Mary Colechurch in the City of London. We know almost nothing about his personal life. We do know he held a royal seal, and almost certainly ran the project day to day, ordering stone, timber, and skilled labor for what became one of the largest construction efforts medieval England had ever attempted. It took 33 years. Peter died in 1205, 4 years before his bridge was finished in 1209 by 3 other London citizens who saw it through. He was buried in the crypt of a chapel built directly on the bridge, dedicated to St. Thomas Becket, the martyred Archbishop of Canterbury. Pilgrims heading to Becket's shrine at Canterbury would stop and pray there on their way out of the city. Now, quietly, almost nobody talks about this next part, and it might be the most remarkable thread in this entire story. Maintaining a stone bridge across a tidal river was staggeringly expensive, forever. So a fund was set up, run from a building on the bridge's southern end called, appropriately, Bridge House. In 1282, King Edward I made it official by royal charter. It's known today as Bridge House Estates, or, in its current form, the City Bridge Foundation. This fund collected tolls from everyone crossing, rent from shops and houses built along the bridge, and even fines for illegal fishing under the arches. Over the centuries it grew so wealthy through property investment that it became entirely self-sufficient. It's still operating today. It funded the construction of Tower Bridge in 1894. It funded the entire £4 million cost of the current London Bridge in 1973, without a single penny of government money. It still owns and maintains 5 of London's Thames bridges. And it distributes tens of millions of pounds a year to charity across the city. A 900-year-old institution, born entirely out of the practical need to keep one medieval bridge from falling down. So what did all that money and effort actually build? 19 stone arches, carrying a roadway just over 900 feet long, narrow enough that 2 carts could barely squeeze past each other. A 20th opening held a working wooden drawbridge, so taller ships could pass through. And almost immediately, the authorities allowed houses and shops to be built directly along both sides of the roadway, to help pay for its upkeep. By the late Middle Ages, somewhere between 140 and 200 separate buildings stood on the bridge. Some were 4, 5, even 7 stories tall, with upper floors jutting out over the edges until the whole crossing felt less like a bridge and more like a single, continuous, covered street suspended above the river. Think about what that actually means. People were born on London Bridge. They lived their entire lives on it. They ran shops and workshops on it. They died on it, without ever setting foot on solid ground. Underneath all of that, the river itself was dangerous. Water forced through the narrow gaps between the bridge's piers created fast, violent rapids. Londoners had a grim saying about it: the bridge was built for wise men to walk over, and fools to sail under. Small boats attempting to shoot through the arches, a practice literally called shooting the bridge, drowned often enough that many boatmen preferred to stop, let their passengers walk around on foot, and reboard on the other side, rather than risk it. Among the bridge's landmark buildings was none such house, built between 1577 and 1579 at the site of the old Drawbridge Tower, a spectacularly ornate structure designed by Lewis Stockett, surveyor of the Queen's Works. It was, after Somerset House on the Strand, only the second building of its exact style anywhere in London. The Bridges Chapel had been rebuilt even grander between 1387 and 1396 by Henry Yeverley, the same master mason behind much of Westminster Abbey and Canterbury Cathedral. This wasn't treated as infrastructure. It was treated as one of the most important addresses in the city. Now for the darkest chapter, and it lasted longer than most people assume. From around 1300 until 1678, London Bridge served as the display site for the severed, tar-preserved heads of executed traitors, mounted on iron spikes above the stone gatehouse at the southern end, facing Southwark. That's not a few decades. That's nearly 400 years. The first recorded head belonged to William Wallace, the Scottish resistance leader, executed in 1305 for rebelling against King Edward I. Over the following centuries, the list reads like a highlight reel of English history gone wrong. The rebel leader Jack Cade in 1450. During the religious upheaval of Henry VIII's reign, Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, executed in 1535 for refusing to recognize the king as head of the Church of England. His head stayed on display for roughly a month before his daughter, Margaret Roper, arranged to have it secretly retrieved, reportedly by bribing the keeper of the heads. Yes, that was a real official job. His task was to boil the severed heads, coat them in tar to preserve them against the weather, and mount them on spikes for public display. Bishop John Fisher and the statesman Thomas Cromwell later met the same fate. So did at least one conspirator connected to the gunpowder plot, in 1605. In 1598, a German visitor named Paul Hensner counted more than 30 heads on the gatehouse during a single visit. It was, by every account, both a brutal warning against treason and, bizarrely, a genuine tourist attraction, drawing curious visitors from across Europe. The practice finally ended in 1678. Later Stuart-era traitors' heads went to Temple Bar instead, on the western edge of the city. Here's a modern footnote that fits this story perfectly, because it's about a myth being born in real time. If you visit London Bridge today, you'll see a tall, angled grey stone spike near the southern end, about 80 feet high, erected in 1999. Officially it's called the Southwark Needle. A popular story has spread claiming it's a deliberate memorial to those centuries of severed heads. It's a great story. It's also false, confirmed directly by the people who built it. When journalists asked Eric Perry Architects, the firm responsible, they said there was no symbolic connection to the heads at all. The needle is tilted at a precise angle to physically point across the river toward the original medieval crossing point, near St. Magnus the Martyr Church. It's a marker, not a monument. And yet the myth persists anyway, proof that this bridge can apparently generate a brand new urban legend about itself in under 30 years, stacked directly on top of 600 years of documented, genuinely gruesome history. Fire was this bridge's other constant enemy, and one blaze accidentally saved it from a second, much more famous one. On the 10th of July, 1212, a fire broke out in Southwark, on the bridge's southern approach. It swept north onto the crowded, wooden-fronted bridge itself, trapping people between flames advancing from both directions. Some burned. Some jumped and drowned. Some were crushed by rescue boats trying to save them. The death toll usually quoted is 3,000, but it's worth being precise about where that number actually comes from. It traces back to a single account written by the chronicler John Stow in 1603, nearly 400 years after the fire itself. Most modern historians think it's likely exaggerated, since London's entire population at the time was probably no more than 50,000 people. Even so, contemporaneous references confirm the fire was genuinely catastrophic. The earliest surviving account, from a 1274 legal record, describes it burning the bridge, its chapel, and the great part of the city. Whatever the real number, it was almost certainly the deadliest fire in London's history, worse than the fire everyone actually remembers. That 1633 fire ended up saving the bridge 33 years later. When the Great Fire of London tore through the city in September 1666, the gap left by the unrepaired 1633 blaze acted as an accidental firebreak, a stretch of the bridge with nothing left standing to burn. That gap stopped the flames from racing straight across the entire span. The bridge still took serious damage, including to the water wheels beneath its arches that pumped water into the city. But the medieval structure survived the very fire that leveled most of the rest of London around it. By the mid-1700s, this crowded medieval bridge had become a genuine public menace, chronically congested, structurally strained under the weight of its own buildings, and increasingly embarrassing for a modernizing city. In 1756, Parliament passed the London Bridge Act, giving the City Corporation legal power to buy up every remaining property on the bridge and tear them down. While that work was underway, a temporary wooden bridge went up just west of the old crossing to keep traffic moving. It opened in October 1757. 6 months later, in April 1758, it caught fire and collapsed, reportedly after a passing footman dropped his lit torch into the woodwork. The old medieval bridge had to be hastily reopened while a second temporary structure was finished. Once the houses were finally cleared by 1762, engineers replaced the bridge's narrow central piers with one much wider central arch, the Great Arch, specifically to calm the dangerous rapids that had made the crossing so hazardous for 5 centuries. Even with that improvement, contemporary estimates put the annual death toll from watermen and sailors drowning under the bridge at around 50 people a year. A brutal, largely forgotten toll, from a structure most people now only know as a children's song. By the early 1800s, even this improved bridge was considered obsolete. In 1825, construction began on an entirely new London Bridge, about 90 feet upstream of the old one, designed by the Scottish civil engineer John Rennie, completed under his son's supervision after Rennie Sr.'s death. Built from Haytor granite quarried on Dartmoor, it measured 928 feet long and 49 feet wide, carried on far fewer, far larger arches than its medieval predecessor. It opened on the 1st of August, 1831, with King William IV and Queen Adelaide attending a banquet held in a purpose-built pavilion on the bridge itself. Among the first ships to pass beneath its arches was HMS Beagle, the very ship that would later carry a young Charles Darwin around the world on the voyage that shaped the theory of evolution. By the end of that century, Rennie's Bridge had become the single busiest crossing point in the city, an almost unimaginable 8,000 pedestrians and 900 vehicles an hour during peak periods. That congestion is directly why several other Thames bridges got built nearby, just to relieve the pressure. When the bridge was widened in the early 1900s, a fresh batch of granite pillars was quarried and cut on Dartmoor for the job, but ultimately went unused. To this day, a dozen of those abandoned blocks still lie beside a disused railway track near Princetown, waiting for a bridge that was never built. This is where the story stops being merely historical and starts being genuinely bizarre. By the 1920s, structural surveys found that Rennie's granite bridge, straining under a volume and weight of traffic it was never designed for, was slowly sinking into the Thames riverbed at roughly 1 inch every 8 years, and unevenly, with the eastern side settling 3 to 4 inches lower than the west. It would eventually need replacing entirely. In 1967, a City of London councilman named Ivan Lukin proposed what he later admitted most of his colleagues thought was a mad idea. Instead of simply demolishing the sinking Victorian bridge, why not try to sell it? It worked. On the 18th of April, 1968, American entrepreneur Robert P. McCulloch, who'd made his fortune manufacturing chainsaws and outboard boat engines, placed the winning bid, $2.4 million. He reportedly arrived at that number by doubling the estimated $1.2 million cost of dismantling the bridge, then adding an extra $60,000, $1,000 for every year of his own age. McCulloch was, at the time, developing a brand new planned community on the shore of a reservoir in the Arizona desert, called Lake Havasu City. A town that, frankly, needed a serious hook to convince anyone to move there. He wasn't the only bidder. The American entertainer Red Skelton reportedly competed for the bridge too, before McCulloch's offer won out. Every one of the bridge's 10,276 exterior granite blocks was individually numbered, shipped across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, up the California coast, then trucked overland into the Arizona desert. There, they were used to clad a brand new steel-reinforced concrete structure, built specifically to carry modern vehicle traffic. That technique dropped the bridge's overall weight from around 130,000 tons down to about 30,000, while preserving almost the entire original 19th century granite facing. The rebuilt bridge reopened in Lake Havasu City on the 10th of October, 1971, with fireworks, hot air balloons, skydivers, and marching bands. It's still there today, spanning an artificial channel in the middle of the Arizona desert. It has become the second most visited man-made attraction in the entire state, behind only the Grand Canyon, drawing several million visitors a year to walk across a genuine piece of 19th century London that most of them assume, until they arrive, must surely be a themed replica. And now, let's finally kill one of the most persistent urban legends in modern British and American history, properly, with the actual sources. For decades, a hugely popular story has claimed that Robert McCulloch made an embarrassing mistake, that he actually believed he was buying London's far more famous, far more photogenic Tower Bridge, with its twin Gothic towers, and only discovered his error once the granite had already landed in Arizona. It's one of the most widely repeated pieces of British trivia in the United States. It's also false. Both McCulloch himself and Ivan Lupkin, the councilman who personally brokered the sale, denied the story throughout their lives. And McCulloch's own grandson, Michael McCulloch, later traveled to London and told the BBC directly that his grandfather knew exactly what he was buying. According to Michael, his grandfather understood something else entirely. That the myth, however untrue, was free publicity, drawing curious tourists to a small desert town that otherwise had nothing to draw them at all. So he simply never bothered to correct it. That's not a story about a mistake. That's a story about a businessman letting a myth do his marketing for him, 50 years before anyone called that going viral. The London Bridge that actually stands over the Thames today, the plain concrete one everyone walks past without a photo, replaced Rennie's sold-off Victorian structure. It was designed by the architect Lord Halford, alongside engineers Mart, Hay and Anderson, and built between 1967 and 1972 by the firm John Molam and Company. Queen Elizabeth II officially opened it on the 16th of March, 1973. Its 3 spans of pre-stressed concrete box girders, 928 feet long, deliberately built without ornamentation, functional rather than beautiful, in stark contrast to almost every other bridge along the Thames. Engineers built it using a genuinely clever phased method. New girders went up upstream and downstream of the existing Victorian bridge.
When we started this project, the goal was never just about the building itself, but how it integrates with the existing cityscape.
Bridge finally demolished to make way for the 2 central sections. In 1984, the Royal Navy frigate HMS Jupiter collided with the bridge while leaving the Pool of London, becoming wedged underneath it after its captain declined offered tugboat assistance while navigating strong tidal currents, a misjudgment that damaged both ship and bridge, and led to a court-martial. Repairs were completed without long-term disruption, and this same unglamorous concrete bridge has now carried Londoners and visitors across the Thames for over 50 years. There's one more chapter that has to be told honestly, because it's part of this bridge's real, recent history, and skipping it would be dishonest. On the evening of the 3rd of June, 2017, 3 attackers deliberately drove a rented van into pedestrians on London Bridge, then crashed near Borough Market and continued attacking people on foot with knives. 8 people were killed. Dozens more were injured, before armed police shot and killed all 3 attackers within roughly 8 minutes of the first emergency call. It was one of several terrorist attacks that struck the UK that year. London's mayor at the time, Sadiq Khan, called it a deliberate and cowardly attack on innocent Londoners, and said the city would not be intimidated. London Bridge and Borough Market have since fully reopened, and remain among the busiest, most visited parts of the city. Protective barriers went up on London Bridge and several other central London bridges soon afterward, a permanent, visible reminder that most people now barely register as they cross. Much like the bridge itself has absorbed every other tragedy in its 2,000-year history, and simply carried on. Today, London Bridge carries roughly 20,000 vehicles a day, and over 17,000 pedestrians an hour at peak times, making it, even in its plain concrete form, one of the busiest river crossings in Europe. It sits at the western edge of what was historically the Pool of London, about 98 feet upstream from where the medieval bridge once stood. St. Magnus the Martyr Church still marks the traditional northern end of the old crossing. Southwark Cathedral marks the southern end, exactly where it always did. And half a mile downstream stands the bridge most people around the world actually picture when they hear the words London Bridge, Tower Bridge, opened in 1894, built in dramatic Victorian Gothic style specifically to complement the nearby Tower of London, and, in a nice piece of continuity, also built and still maintained by that same 900-year-old Bridge House Estates charity. It's worth pausing on why this particular story tends to land so differently depending on which side of the Atlantic you're watching from. For a British audience, the pull is usually the sheer, unbroken continuity of it, the idea that Roman engineers, a medieval priest, a Tudor executioner, and a 20th-century construction firm were all, centuries apart, working on exactly the same stretch of the Thames. For an American audience, the pull tends to be the reverse, the sheer improbability that a piece of Victorian London ended up rebuilt, stone by numbered stone, in the middle of the Arizona desert, and that an entire thriving American town exists largely because one chainsaw manufacturer had a hunch about tourism. Both reactions are really about the same underlying fact. In every version it has ever taken, this bridge has never once been just a bridge. So the next time you hear children singing about London Bridge falling down, or see a photo online, confidently captioned with the wrong bridge entirely, or stumble across an American road trip video proudly showing off the original London Bridge, sitting in the middle of the Arizona desert, you'll know the real story behind all of it. A bridge that Romans built, that Vikings may have torn down, that medieval Londoners lived and died on top of, that English monarchs used, for 300 years, to display the tarred heads of their enemies, that the Great Fire of London somehow failed to destroy, that a 900-year-old charity has quietly kept standing through 8 centuries of tolls and rent, and that one very shrewd American businessman turned into one of the most enduring, and most misunderstood, urban legends in modern history. Almost everything most people think they know about London Bridge, what it looks like, why it fell down, who actually bought it and why, turns out to be at least partly wrong. The real story was better all along. If you want more deep dives like this, the real history hiding behind the names everyone thinks they already know, subscribe. There's a lot more to uncover, and very little of it is what you were taught to expect.